this next book is a bit of a classic in its own field, and really is appropriate when talking about the 20th century in context. It's by a Polish writer named Czeslaw Milosz. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's called The Captive Mind. Czeslaw Milosz was a poet who eventually won the Nobel Prize much later. He wrote this in the early 50s, just a handful of years after the end of World War II. But I wanted to start this review off by quoting something that's quoted in the book, but it's not from the book. It's a quote. It's a quote from Arthur Gobineau, and this is from his Religions and Philosophies of Central Asia, which sounds like a very plotting book, doesn't it? But this is a really fascinating little bit that Milosz quotes in the text. Gobineau writes, "There are occasions when silence no longer suffices, when it may pass as an avowal. Then one must not hesitate. Not only must one deny one's true opinion, but one is commanded to resort to all ruses to deceive one's adversary. One makes all the protestations of faith that can please him, one performs all the rites one recognizes to be the most vain, one falsifies one's books, one exhausts all possible means of deceit." And that, in a few sentences, sums up the tone of this book. How, especially intellectuals, how people, but especially intellectuals, writers, artists, poets, wrestled with communism while it was, obviously the prevailing ideology of the day, and how that influenced their art, their thought processes. I mean, what does it mean to make art when you were under the inextricable influence of an ideology? The Captive Mind, as I said, was written in the early 50s, immediately after Milosz was awarded political asylum in France. And it's one of the first real attempts that I know of to articulate the appeal of communism, or more broadly, I guess you could call it, Marx's dialectical materialism, to the intellectuals all over Eastern Europe. Central to the novel, and I guess it is a novel, even though he's talking about real historical events. He disguises the characters that I'll mention in a second, but we know who they are. We know who he's really talking about, even though he never mentions their real names. Central to the novel are the four characters identified by Milosz only as Alpha, Beta, Delta, and Gamma, but who we know respectively as Jerzy Andrzejewski, Tadeusz Borowski, Józef Putrimo, and Konstanty Ildefons Galzinski. The last writer I'd never heard of before, so then again, my sincere apologies if I'm sure I did slaughter their names. Each of the four has uniquely different relationships to writing, and thinks differently about the ways that dialectical materialism affects their writing and their thinking more generally. In Alpha's youth, his far-right politics calls him into writing with the force of moral authority. He later eschews these politics and becomes a Catholic who speaks out against anti-Semitism. After World War II ends, Alpha's writing ideologically aligns itself with the puppet governments that set themselves up in Eastern Europe, and he's later seen only as a bit of a literary prostitute by his former friends. Beta is a poet who, in Beta, by the way, is a Tadeusz Borowski. who spent 2 years in Auschwitz and Dachau, only to later be released by American soldiers. And he later swallows the pills of Murti-Bing, and writes hardline ideological defenses of Leninism and Stalinism. To see what Murti-Bing is, you'll have to read the novel. The experiences of Delta and Gamma are equally typical accounts of when the mind of an intellectual bumps into an intractable ideological system, which inevitably evolves into what Milosz calls Ketman, which means an outward acceptance of an idea while still holding on to unspoken reservations. In fact, this word originally came from Arabic and was imported into English by Arthur Gobineau, who I quoted at the opening of the video himself. The first 2 chapters are incisive in invoking the spirit of invoking the spirit of the communism-addled writer who struggles to balance his priorities. But the middle chapters on the writers seem as untrue, not false in the strict sense, but lacking the clarity of moral, political, aesthetic themes with which he's trying to deal, as the ideology with which he's struggling. While they are presented as individuated, personal characters, the reader gets the feeling that Milosz is trying to turn them into archetypes, while at other times working deliberately against turning them into archetypes, which has an odd way of turning them into alienating abstractions for the reader. Most of all, this book serves as kind of a tocsin, an alarm, a bell. By now, an entire generation of Europeans has had the ability to write, think, and speak publicly about whatever they wish, the very fact of which possibly renders Milosz's book a peculiar curio from the doldrums of intellectual history. For many Americans whose questions of freedom are restricted to whether or not one is allowed to burr their draft card, or a Quran, or utter a prayer in school, reading The Captive Mind may very well have a stultifying effect. If that happens, the book runs the risk, we all run the risk, I guess, of it becoming still even more relevant than it is now. The Captive Mind by Czeslaw Milosz.